I hope that you had a great Thanksgiving with your friends and family this week. I don't know if you've noticed this though, if you spent time with your family, you might have seen, you might have noticed, you might have heard or felt a little bit of dysfunction. Families, almost all families have some dysfunction, might have a lot of dysfunction, might have just a little bit of dysfunction, but there's probably dysfunction in your family somewhere. And that's what we're going to learn about today. Dysfunction in a family, it has the potential to destroy it. And so today we're actually starting a new 4-week series, and we're joining Pastor Trevor today to talk about family dysfunction. We have a new series called The Family Tree that we're going to be starting this week and leading up to Christmas. Now, if you're here today watching and joining us for SMCC Online here this morning, I would love for you to do one thing for me. Can you pull out your phone and can you text the word HERE, like HERE, text the word HERE to 801-794-5338. I would love to know that you're here and also engage with you. I'd just love to know that you're here joining us for SMCC Online. And thank you so much for being here after a long holiday weekend. I love that you are here with us today and just want to welcome you to SMCC Online. As I said earlier, we are starting a new series that will lead us up to Christmas. And with this series, The Family Tree, we have actually, as a staff, poured a lot of creative time and energy and resources into this series. And with that, we have a little bit of an extra resource for you that you can take advantage of. I don't know if you've noticed, but during the holiday season, it feels like we're just kind of doing everything. We're busy, we're constantly going to things, and really we don't ever take time to slow down and to think through what this season is actually about, to actually go through the history of it and even look at how the Old Testament is pointing towards Jesus coming. There's a lot to that comes into the Christmas season. So we have a resource for you and your family that you can sign up for. This is a 25-day Advent devotional. It's called the Jesse Tree Advent Devotional that you can get delivered right to your email box and help you to slow down and to each day go through a little short 60, 90-second devotional that'll go really with this series throughout these 4 weeks leading up to Christmas. So I would really love for you to be able to sign up for that so that you can have it delivered to your email inbox each morning. So here's how you do that. You can open up a new tab in your browser right now and visit smccutah.org/Advent Devotional. No space in between there. It's smccutah.org/Advent Devotional, and that'll take you right to the registration page where you can give us permission to email you each day for 25 days with this Advent Devotional. I think that you and your family will really enjoy it, and it's a time to really say, hey, I just want to take an opportunity to slow down and really focus on this season and really this series that we are going through. I think will be helpful for you. Now, before I keep you for any longer, I want to go ahead and join Pastor Trevor as we now open and start this new series for Christmas, The Family Tree. Let's go ahead and join Pastor Trevor now.
Hey, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here at SMCC. Thanks for joining us today. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I hope the turkey and tryptophan isn't wearing you out too much. And if it is, maybe you got a nap over the holiday break and are feeling rested and refreshed again today. I hope that's the case for you. Now, if I could just ask you a question as we're getting started today. Do you have a favorite memory from Christmas from when you were a kid? Do you have a favorite memory when it comes to the way that you grew up, the way that you experienced Christmas as a kid? I know that I do, and the truth is most of my favorite memories that have to do with Christmas when I was growing up, they all take place at my grandma and my grandpa's house, because every Christmas Eve we would always go there together as a family. And where I grew up, and on Christmas Eve, typically it was cold, it was windy, it was dark, it was snowy, not exactly the kind of circumstances where you want to be outside a whole lot, and yet we'd bundle into the car, make our way on over to my grandma and grandpa's house, where we'd go on inside and see the rest of our extended family and just spend the day together. And it was always so much fun. There was games, and there was food, and there were presents, and there were the cranberries that had been taken out of the can and cut into slices exactly in the way that they're meant to be enjoyed. And it was always so much fun. And when I go back to some of my favorite Christmas memories, they take place at my grandma and my grandpa's house there. And in fact, just a few months ago, I had the chance when we were back in the Midwest to swing by my grandma's place and just spend a couple hours with her, visiting her. And I always like getting the chance to do that. And when I went into her house, every time I go there, I feel like in some ways I'm stepping back into those memories, like I'm stepping into the past. And even if I'm there in the middle of the summer or in the early parts of fall, it feels like I'm stepping in back into those memories on Christmas Eve when I was just a little kid. I can still hear and feel and smell the echoes of those memories. And there's so much nostalgia, and that's one of my favorite reasons for hanging out there. But there's also something else to it. There's a reason that it feels like stepping back into the past to me. There's a reason why so many of those memories, I think, are anchored from so long ago. And I think one of the biggest reasons with that is because there was a little bit of mess, a little bit of dysfunction within my own family that led to an alteration to the way that we spent the holidays when I was growing up. You could say that there was a little dysfunction in my family that led to that. And I think the truth is that there's a little dysfunction in every family. There's a little dysfunction in every family. And I'm betting that I don't have to argue too hard to get you to admit that about your own. Be it mild or severe, we all have a little bit of mess in every one of our families. And when it came to my own, that manifested itself in a particular way when I was growing up. That resulted in a divorce and us moving to a new town and kind of an alteration to the way that we spent the holidays. And I still loved Christmas growing up. I still have good memories from kind of every season of life with it. And yet, it changed the way that we celebrated it, the way that we spent Christmas Eve. And it left a lot of those experiences in the past and with nostalgia. And it left them as memories. And I think the interesting thing about that, about the holidays in general and when it comes to family, is that, if we have a little bit of dysfunction in our family, if we have some difficulties with our relationships, I think the majority of the year we have ways of kind of getting by. We have strategies and methods for coping with it where we don't necessarily feel it to its full force, to its full weight. And yet, without fail, when the holidays roll around, the health or the dysfunction of our families, I think we feel it the most in the holiday season. Though it may be the most wonderful time of the year, it is also the season of the year when the health of our families impresses itself upon us the most. That's why here at SMCC, we're starting this brand new series called The Family Tree. We're leading up to Christmas. We're going to be diving into one particular family in the Bible that had its own mess, that had its own fair share of dysfunction. The goal being really to study that family, to look at its culture and the way that they interacted with one another. And in doing so, to learn some lessons that we can then take and apply in the context of our own lives and our own families, so that we can take the axe to dysfunction in our own families. Because here's the key idea really underpinning this entire series, that if you don't deal with dysfunction, it can destroy your family. If you don't deal with dysfunction, it can destroy your family. I think in a lot of ways it works kind of like our Christmas lights, where, every year when January rolls around, we take them down and we put them into these bins and you stuff them somewhere out of sight where you can't see them. And without fail, when you take them out in November or December and you try and hang them up again, they are this horrible, knotted, tangled mess. It doesn't matter how neat they were when you put them away. It doesn't matter if you wrapped them nicely. When you go to take the bin out, it's like they were moving, spending the entire year trying to figure out how they can knot themselves up so much so that you can't do anything with them. That is exactly how dysfunction works also. It's not the kind of thing that just goes away or stops growing when we turn a blind eye to it or when we put it in the bin and find a spot for it in the crawl space. But it continues to grow. It continues to develop. And if we don't engage with it, if we don't deal with it, it has the potential to destroy our families. Now, I will say that thankfully, one of our values here at SMCC is that we teach the truth of the Bible in a helpful and hopeful way. And so if this has been hitting on a bit of a raw nerve already, let me just say that we're planning to turn the ship around. And the goal of the series is not just to talk about or to feel the weight of or to diagnose dysfunction. While that's part of it, but even more than that, the goal is to give us some tools really to equip us to handle dysfunction well, so that in doing so, we can move into healthier families marked more by joy, more by peace, and really feel some of the fullness of this season in a way that where we can move into the joy of this season that so many Hallmark movies seem to indicate is possible. Except instead of finding it and forsaking an urban career and in cultivating a small town romance, we'll be taking hold of it by learning about the teachings of Jesus and finding out and learning how to apply them well in the context of our own lives and families. So that's where we're going with this series, and that's where we're going today. Now, if I could just kind of set this up a little bit, I want to give you two reasons for why we're looking at the particular family in the Bible that we are. And the family is King David's family, really significant person in the Old Testament in the history of the people of Israel. And you could say it's his family. You could also say that it's the family of his father, Jesse. And we're going to be looking at them over the course of this entire series. And I want to give you two reasons why, one being theological, the other being practical. So just kind of laying those out. The first reason, the theological reason, comes from this tradition that originated roughly around 1,000 years ago, developed in the medieval ages, called the Jesse tree, named after Jesse, who is David's father, King David's father. And really the tradition is something that takes place in this season of the year, building up to Christmas. It's tied in with the devotional that Adam mentioned in the beginning. And really, it all stems from two things, or really from one thread made up of two individual strands of a promise and a prophecy. And so if I could just take a couple minutes and kind of break that down for us here today. The promise really comes from 2 Samuel 7, and it's a promise that God makes to King David himself. And in the context of the passage, David is wanting to build a house for God, wanting to build a temple for God in the city of Jerusalem, the capital city of Israel. And God tells him, no, you're not going to be the one who does that. And then in response to that, he makes this promise to him. And we see this one especially important piece of the promise coming in 2 Samuel 7, verse 13, that reads like this. God saying to David, he is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. He, meaning one of David's descendants, he is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, in some ways, if you read the broader context, in some ways, this was fulfilled through David's own son, Solomon, who reigned after him and took the plans that David had designed and executed them and did, in fact, build that temple, that house for God in the city of Jerusalem. So in some ways, Solomon fulfilled it, but in other ways, there are aspects to this promise that were never fulfilled in the life of Solomon or in any other king throughout the history of Israel. And even throughout the generations and throughout the centuries that followed after David and after Solomon, the people of Israel read this promise in that particular way, always looking for the king who would arise, who would fulfill this promise, the king whose throne would be established not just for a generation, not just for a lifetime, but one who would reign in righteousness for all of eternity. That being the content of the promise, that one of David's descendants would reign upon the throne forever. And so for king after king after king, they were always awaiting the fulfillment of this promise. And then at a certain point down the line, hundreds of years after David and Solomon, something horrific happened. Something that's referred to as the Babylonian exile, where the Babylonian Empire, really this superpower at the time in the world, came in and surrounded Jerusalem, put it under siege, and ended up basically destroying the throne, decimating the kingdom, overthrowing the entire nation of Israel, and hauling off the king to exile in chains. And from that moment forward, no longer was there a throne in Israel. No longer was there a kingdom in Israel. And the question is, how could the promise ever be fulfilled of a king who would reign forever if there was no kingdom, if there was no king to reign? And yet there was one thing that came into the midst of all of this that offered hope, the second strand within the thread, that being the prophecy coming from the book of Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah. And there's really two things that he prophesied. One coming in chapter 3, where he prophesies about the destruction of Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem, the overthrowing of the king by the Babylonian Empire. And he prophesies about that beforehand. But then even furthermore, in connection with the promise, he prophesies that this king that they had awaited for so long would one day arise, and that the throne and the kingdom would be reestablished, and this king would come and reign forever. And we see that prophecy coming in Isaiah chapter 11. And just to read a portion of this for us, it reads like this. It says in verse 1, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit." So the stump of Jesse, again, the reference being to Jesse, the father of David. And notice the language of stump. It's sort of it's using this imagery that the throne was like a tree that continued to grow from Jesse to David to Solomon and on down the line. With every successive king, the tree continued to grow larger and taller. And yet when the Babylonian Empire came, it was as if an axe were laid to it. And the tree was cut down and the stump lay dead and fallow and lifeless. And it continued to do so for generations and for centuries. And yet what Isaiah's prophecy here is getting at is that one day a new shoot will come from that stump. New life will arise, a new king, the king who will fulfill the promise of 2 Samuel 7 will come. And he goes on to describe the king saying this in verse 2, that the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, the Spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth, right? His reign is described in the same way that God's is in the Psalms, in particular Psalm 89, that says that righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. And the same is true of this king. And jumping ahead to verse 10, "In that day the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples," the banner of Jesus. "The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious." So, for generations, for centuries, the people of Israel, as they were ruled over by all of these different kingdoms, the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks, and finally the Romans, they were always looking to this thread made up of both the promise and the prophecy, awaiting the fulfillment of each of them. And then on one silent and holy and starry night in Bethlehem, that king was born. And that's exactly what we celebrate at this time of the year. And that's why the Jesse tree tradition is something that builds up to Christmas, as it traces every one of these stories, every one of these stories in the promise and the prophecy, and shows how they're all pointing to Jesus and really looking forward to the day of his birth, the day of his arrival. And so all that really what I mean to say is that Jesus fulfilled both the promise and the prophecy of an eternal righteous king. Jesus fulfilled both the promise and the prophecy of an eternal righteous king. And if I could just add one thing to it, just to kind of help us feel this a little bit more. The famed musician and composer J.S. Bach, who also happened to be a Christian, happened to be a devoted follower of Jesus, his children had a particularly inventive way of getting on his nerves, really of getting under his skin. And it was that when J.S. happened to be on the other side of the house, what his children would do is they would go up to his piano and they would play it loud enough for him to hear wherever he was. And what they would do is begin to plunk out the keys in order, playing out one after another the entirety of a scale. And yet right before the final note, they would stop and they would creep away from the piano, find some place to wait in hiding and to see what unfolded. And when J.S. heard that lingering note, that unresolved tension in the music from all the way across the house, he would come storming in all the way over into the room to the piano, and he would slam his finger down on the key that would bring the scale to its close, that would finally bring the resolution to the music, which I find both humorous and impressive that he knew which key to strike. I would be at an utter and complete loss when it came to that. But when it came to the Israelites waiting for the fulfillment of this promise and this prophecy, it was as if every key in the scale had been played across centuries, and the music was left lingering, the tension left hanging in the air, that it was incomplete, that there was still something to come. And on that final night, when Jesus was born, the final note was played, and the resolution was found, and in the sweet and sudden way, the music was completed. And so the Jesse tree is all about entering back into that season of expectation, that waiting for Jesus' arrival, as we await his second return in the same way that they awaited his first return. And so that's what the tradition is all about. And when it comes to a theological reason, that's why we've chosen really to focus in on the family of Jesse and on the family of King David. But with our idea of the family tree and taking an axe to dysfunction, there is also thankfully a practical reason for why we can look at this family. And it's because they had no lack of mess and dysfunction when it came to the way that they were with each other also. And thankfully, that's been recorded for us in full and living color. And so the goal really and the hope being to look at that, to study it, to examine it, and to take lessons from it that we can then take and apply in the context of our own lives. And that's really what I want to move into doing for the rest of our time here today. And so with that, let's go ahead and jump into 1 Samuel 16, where we really are introduced to David and Jesse and their family for the very first time in the Bible. So 1 Samuel 16, and we will meet them there. And it reads like this at the very beginning. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." All right, so what's happening here is Saul is the prophet who plays a particular role within the nation of Israel, within the kingdom of Israel. And part of his responsibilities is anointing the one who will be king. He played that role with King Saul, the first king, anointing him and even establishing him as the king that God had chosen. And yet at this point in the narrative, Saul has made decisions that have disqualified him from being king. And so the throne is passing not only from him personally, but even from his family into another one. And Samuel knows this, but it's still a question as to who the next king will be, as to who the one will be that he anoints to follow Saul in being the king over Israel. And in this chapter, God begins to draw back the curtain on who his selection is as he takes Samuel and gives him these directions, these instructions, sending him to the little town of Bethlehem to meet someone there by the name of Jesse, because one of his sons will be the next king over Israel. And so Samuel, he takes these instructions, he goes to Bethlehem, and he makes a sacrifice, which basically is the equivalent of throwing a feast, right? Having this massive barbecue. And so there's plenty of beef, plenty of brisket. He invites Jesse and has him bring all of his sons, tells him to bring every one of his sons because God has chosen one of them to be king. And whichever one it is will be made clear at this feast, at this barbecue. And so this is what happens when Jesse and his sons arrive. Picking it up at verse 6, it says this. When they arrived, meaning Jesse and his sons, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." So Samuel sees Jesse and his sons rolling up on the party, and he sees one of them who is head and shoulders standing all above the rest. He is tall, dark, and handsome. He's got an education. He has got the best truck in the parking lot. He is surely the one who is going to be king. Samuel says, "I know, this is the guy. This is the one that you have chosen." And yet, this is God's response. Verse 7. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, For I have rejected him. Not rejected him in the sense of a relationship, but rejected him in the sense that he hasn't been chosen to be king. It's one of the other sons. And he says, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab, thinking if it's not Eliab, surely it's Abinadab. It's the next tallest, the next most handsome, the next most impressive son. It must be Abinadab, and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. And Jesse said, well, if it's not him, then maybe it's Shammah. And so he had him pass by. But Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen any of these. And at this point, you can almost imagine Samuel leaning into Jesse, beginning to say, help me understand. Was I not clear when I presented the invitation to this barbecue? Right? When I went through all of the work of preparing this meat, was I not clear in my intention of coming here? I told you to bring all of your sons, and yet the 7 sons that you brought me, none of them are the son that God has chosen to be king. And so help me understand what's happening here. Is there some son that for some reason you failed to bring? Jesse, you can imagine him beginning to think to himself, saying, no, I brought all of my sons. I brought all of my sons that were worth bringing. I mean, I guess if you're really going to press me on it, there is still the youngest. There's still David, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. He's off kind of taking care of them. So no, I didn't bring you all of my sons, but I did bring you all of my sons that were worth bringing. I brought you every one of my sons that had even a shred of potential for fulfilling the role for which you have come to find them. I brought all of the sons that were worth bringing. Samuel says, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. You can begin to feel in Samuel's response that he's feeling a little bit hot under the collar, that this father has overlooked one of his sons and didn't even think he was worth bringing to the barbecue. And so Samuel sends for him and says, we're not going to sit down until he gets here. And I think kind of the funny thing about this is that David probably isn't just around the corner. He's probably a good distance away. And he's saying, if you can't follow instructions, then I'm going to teach you how to follow instructions. And we're not sitting down. We're not resting or relaxing until he gets here. But then finally, David does arrive. And this is what happens. Verse 12. So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. And so David did have the outer appearance thing going for him, and yet we can see clearly from the passage that that is not why God chose him, but that there was something inward, something internal to David that delighted God. And he chose him for that very reason. Verse 13. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And Samuel then went to Ramah. In this story, it's interesting because it almost reads like a reverse Cinderella story. Right? Not in the sense that it's riches to rags, but in the sense that instead of princess, girl to princess, it's boy to king. Right? And both of them are kind of left out, locked away, and kept from the opportunities that are being presented to the rest of the family. Except instead of a despised stepdaughter locked away in a tower and kept from the ball, it's this youngest child, this boy who was overlooked and cast off with the sheep and kept from the barbecue and kept from the opportunity of being selected as the next king of Israel. The only difference between the stories is that Cinderella is a fairy tale and that King David was a real historical person. And what we have here is his story. And I think what's also interesting is that Samuel anoints him as the next king in Israel in the presence of all of his brothers, which I'm sure was something that didn't go over all that well. And yet, this was the beginning of a series of events that continued to unfold and eventually led David into becoming the most beloved king that Israel ever had. But this story here, these origins of where David comes from and how his ascension to the throne began, it's recorded for us and it's given to us in order to teach something. And really, what it's teaching is this lesson that is all about how God understands us and our value and our worth in a way that so often is so completely different from the way that we understand ourselves. That in the passage, it makes this contrast between how we look at people, how we evaluate them, how we measure them, and how God does. And I think what's interesting about that is that so often we have a tendency to look at other people and to kind of size them up according to so many different things. But the reason we do that to other people is because first and foremost, we do that to ourselves. We have all of these measures and methods for figuring out some estimation of our own value, of our own worth, where we look at our job title and our job performance and our relational status and the kind of the perfect picture of our family, whether it's there or whether it's lacking. We look at the size and beauty of our house. We look at our style and fashion. We look at even our physical beauty and appearance. We look at all of these things as individual sums that we kind of put into this calculation that gives us some estimation of what our worth is in comparison to those around us. And what this passage is showing for us, what it's demonstrating to us, is that God doesn't evaluate us like that at all. And that what God is really concerned with is not how we measure up according to these particular measures and methods that we use, but God is concerned with how we measure our worth. God is concerned with how we measure our worth. And really, that's a gift, right? To receive that lesson from this passage, because to constantly be trying to live into these different things, to perform for our worth, to earn our value, is an exhausting thing. And yet when it comes to God, what he's demonstrating to us is that if we're wondering what our worth is with him, we don't have to worry, because with him it's already been said. If we're worried about what our value is with him, we don't have to worry, because with him our value has already been set. And here at SMCC, we talk a lot about being equipped well to follow Jesus, that in the life that Jesus has invited us into, it is one that is marked by joy, marked by peace, marked by loving relationships and so many good and delightful and enjoyable things. And yet in order to live into the fullness of that, we have to be equipped. And one of the key areas we need to be equipped in is in our hearts. Your heart being the place where your identity abides. The manner in which you figure out what your worth is, the manner in which you come to an understanding of what your value is. And what the passage shows us is that David grew up within a family that measured worth and measured value in a particular way, that it was something to be earned, that status was not granted, was not given, but it was something that had to be performed for. And that really shows us an interesting point, that when it comes to how we run our lives, how we organize them, how we try and earn our own worth ourselves, we can ask the question, where does that come from? How did that arrive? And I think the answer for most of us is that our families taught us where our worth is. Our families taught us where our worth is. And I know when it comes to my own life, that's something that I would say I've experienced as well. And if I was just to kind of talk about that, I think the thing that I would say is that what I heard growing up, sort of the message that was repeated over and over and over again, was that your value, your worth is measured by your performance. That the better you perform, the more you have value, the more worth that you have. And let me be clear, that's not something that my mom or my dad ever sat me down and said. And in fact, if I had ever voiced that, they would have countered it and said the exact opposite. And yet, so often this is a lesson that we learn, not by any formal lecture. It's not something that we learn from anyone actually sitting down and instructing us. But when it comes to finding our worth and our value in life, that's a lesson that is taught to our hearts. And it can end up being a particularly difficult lesson to unlearn for that very reason. And what kids pay attention to is just what gets celebrated, what gets discussed, what earns attention, what do people talk about. And you begin to equate that with value and with worth and even with love. And I applied that in a lot of different ways in different seasons throughout my life. And I know one of them, when I was in high school in particular, was basketball. Right? And again, no one ever said that you are only as valuable as you are good at this game, that your worth is entirely wrapped up within your performance at this. Nobody ever said that. And yet when it came to what gets celebrated, what gets discussed, even in the broader community, even in the surrounding culture, it was that. That was the thing that was celebrated. And that's what led me into setting all of these ridiculously high standards that really were just silly and not beneficial or helpful at all, because at the end of the day, I wasn't just playing a game. I wasn't just a kid playing a game. I was playing for my worth, because my performance in that had become the place in which my identity rested, the place in which my identity abided. And there's an extra layer of irony to it, because I'm only like 5'9", and I wasn't gifted with a miraculous vertical. So that's not lost on me that I chose a category to perform in that I wasn't particularly well suited for. And yet I think the truth is that when this is a lesson that we've learned within our hearts to perform for our worth, to earn our value, we take it and apply it to so many different things. We apply it to academics. We apply it to athletics. We apply it to work. We apply it to our performance. We apply it to hobbies, apply it to relationships, to all of these different ways that we're working and that we're striving to show that we have value, that we are worth something. And the thing is, if we never stop to evaluate that, if we never stop to really just take stock and to reflect and to consider the methods and the measures that we were given for understanding our worth, if we never check to see if those are sound or if they're dysfunctional, then what that leads to is just the perpetuating of the problem. Just like the Christmas lights, they continue to get tangled not only in our lives, but even in the lives of our families, in the lives of our children, because we go on to create the very same culture that teaches the very same lesson. And I think, as we all know well, it becomes a very difficult lesson to unlearn, because it's a lesson taught to the heart. And so as we're getting into this series and beginning to kind of get under the surface on what is the dysfunction within this particular family, this is one of the elements. And I would say this is even the starting place, dealing with this, for going into all of the rest of it, for really taking an axe to dysfunction well and building healthy and joyful families. And so the question is, when it comes to this particular issue, how do we do that? How do we address it? I want to spend a couple of minutes unpacking that. But first, let me just acknowledge that I think when it comes to this, while the issue may be the same, it's something that we arrive at from many different angles, many different circumstances. And it may be something where you're dealing with some family of origin stuff, that you were given some formula for understanding your worth that has caused issues within your life, issues within your relationships, and it's caused pain even within your own family. And you're trying to figure out, how do I deal with this better? How do I find some other way to measure this, some other way to understand this that is helpful? And how do I help repair and go about these relationships with my family better? Maybe you're someone who has raised your children. They are grown and they're out of the house at this point, and you're looking back over those years of parenthood, and you realize that what you've instilled within them was something that was less than adequate. And you're trying to figure out how to deal with that, and even how to go about having a better relationship with your adult children now. Or maybe you're in the season of life and the circumstances where you're kind of in the throes of parenthood right now. That's where I'm at, where you're trying to figure out, how do I instill something within my children? How do I educate their hearts in such a way that they understand where their worth is, that their identity abides in a place that is good for them, that allows them joy and rest and peace? How do I teach them and raise them in that way? So there's a lot of different angles that we can approach the question from, approach the issue from. But thankfully, no matter where we're coming at it from, the foundation, the starting place is the same. Because one really key idea for this is just this, that until we change how we measure our worth, we'll never change how we measure others. Until we change how we measure our worth, we'll never change how we measure the worth of others, the worth of those around us, the worth of those that we're in relationship with. And that's one of the key things that Jesus has offered to us in the life that he's invited us into, is a new way of understanding our value, of seeing our worth that is grounded, that is secure, that we don't have to perform for, that cannot be taken away. And if you're wondering where that is or what that is, the answer is you don't have to look any further than Jesus on the cross to understand what your value is. That God himself, in the second person of the Trinity, Jesus, was willing to take on our humanity, to live the perfect life that we couldn't, to give his life on the cross in our place, and to do so that we could be invited into the life with him, into this life with him, into a relationship with him. That alone shows the measure of his love for us and the worth that he places upon us. And when we learn to embrace that, when we learn to remind ourselves continually of that is the place where our worth is found, that is the place where our identity can rest and be secure and abide, then that in turn gives us a really grounded place to work from, and it changes every other relationship that we have in this life, because no longer are we working for our worth, no longer are we performing for it, and no longer are we requiring that of others. And so when it comes to the person who's dealing with the family of origin stuff, it gives you a grounded place to be able to handle these things, a grounded place to be able to respond, so that even if you're catching harsh comments in the form of compliments given to more successful cousins and little biting remarks given about how you're not as successful as you pass the mashed potatoes over the holidays, right? You can deal with that because you can remind yourself that your identity and your value and your worth is secure in Jesus. And in turn, you can move into having a relationship with your own parents, with your own siblings, even with your cousins, right? But especially your parents, where you're not measuring their worth according to their performance as your parents. And you can begin to love and to respect and honor them exactly where they're at. Perhaps setting boundaries if it's necessary, but moving into a better relationship in that way. And for the person whose adult children are grown, right, and you're looking back with regrets, wishing you could have done things different, the one thing I'd want you to hear is that it's never too late. And that what it really looks like to embrace this, first off, is to stop measuring your own worth according to your performance as a parent, but to receive the forgiveness, to accept that you're not perfect, that none of us are perfect, and yet still God has loved us to such a degree, and to embrace that. And in doing so, you can then begin to have a relationship with your children where you can love and respect them for exactly where and what they are. And in doing so, hopefully move into a better relationship with them because of it. And for the people like me who are in the midst of the throes of parenting, I'll be honest, I'm still figuring this out as we go, but perhaps the best piece of advice that I could offer would be that what we're trying to do is instill within our kids this lesson learned by the heart, that where their identity rests is not in their performance, not in something they're great at, not in the things that they're wonderful at, but where their identity rests first and foremost is in a love that is grounded and secure and never ending for them. And that love is God's, but we can extend a love similar to that and give them a chance to understand what that is in the context of our own relationships. And I think one way to do that is just to remind them over and over and over again as we celebrate their wins and grieve their losses and are with them for the peaks and the valleys of life, to remind them constantly that our love for them is secure, that I am devoted to your good, that I delight in you. And that is regardless of how bad or how good you are. You don't have to perform for it to earn it, and you can't lose it. Right? It has no, your success or your failures have no bearing upon my love for you and my delight in you. And in treating them and raising them in such a way, imperfectly and with missteps along the way, hopefully we can instill within them the lesson of the heart that our identity must rest in a place of love rather than performance if we're going to have healthy lives and joyful families. Because the bottom line is this: we love others best when we know we're already loved. We love others best when we know we're already loved. And what Jesus has demonstrated for us in the gospel, in his life, in his death, in his resurrection on our behalf, is the extreme amount of love that he has poured out on our behalf. And when we learn to embrace that as the place in which our identity abides, that then in turn can change every other relationship we have in this life, including our families. And we can begin to take an axe to the dysfunction, to untangle the cords in the Christmas lights, and to move into the fullness of joy that Jesus has offered us in the life he's invited us into. Let's pray together. Jesus, we thank you for your word. Thank you for the time together today. Thank you for the record of this family, of Jesse and of King David, and of how it wasn't just the pretty pieces of their lives that were recorded for us, but also the ugly pieces, the mess, the dysfunction, so that we could learn from that. And in doing so, take and apply those lessons in the context of our own lives. And so we thank you for this season. We thank you for the chance to celebrate your birth and to enter into the fullness of everything that it meant and continues to mean for us. And we ask that you would help us to continue to learn how to respond well in the relationships you've given us within family, within friends. And in doing so, really to enter in to the fullness of the joy that you offer to us. So we thank you, we praise you in your name. Amen.
I really appreciated Pastor Trevor's bottom line that we can love others better when we know that we are already loved. I think for me, personally, I don't know about you, but I could use a bottom line like that as we start to get into a busy season with lots of family and friends and busyness, to just know, hey, I can love others better when I know that I am already loved. Now, if you're like me, you are already filling up your December schedule. You're already filling things in the calendar. You're talking about where you're going, what parties you're going to, all the things that are happening. And so I want to give you a little bit something to know about. We have our Christmas Eve times ready for you at our 5 locations. So you can find our Christmas Eve times and details on child care, child programming, all those things at our website. You can go to smccutah.org/Christmas to find each of our locations with their service times for Christmas Eve. You can get that on your calendar right now. We would love to have you at one of our locations. And additionally, I just want to give you a heads up. We actually won't be doing Christmas Eve at SMCC online on December 24th. We really would love for people to come to our locations. If you can physically make it to one of our locations, we think it's going to really be a great thing for you and your family and your friends. So we would love for you to be able to come. Again, that's at smccutah.org/Christmas. And if you love the hopeful and helpful content that we have here each week, here's what I would ask you to do. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video. If you want more people to hear this hopeful and helpful content, that is a free and easy way to actually boost us showing up in people's search results. So subscribe to our YouTube channel and like this video. That'd be a huge favor that you could do for us as a church to reach more people. Lastly, we'll continue in this next week, in week 2 of the Family Tree with Pastor Eric, and we're going to keep talking about dysfunction and the family and the line of Jesse. I think it'll be really interesting. So I hope to see you back here at SMCC Online next week or at one of our 5 locations. Take care.